You ever notice how the world reacts when you finally get one thing right? Just one. Not a lifetime of struggle. Not the nights you spent breaking yourself apart and stitching yourself back together in silence. No, none of that matters. The moment you rise even a little, they start whispering. They look at you like you've crossed some invisible line you were never supposed to reach. Suddenly, your effort becomes a mystery. Your discipline becomes suspicion. Your progress becomes a problem. They can't process it, so they rewrite it. You got lucky. You cheated. There's no way someone like you did that alone. And then comes the best part. The story they tell to make themselves feel safe again. You must have made a deal because it's easier for them to believe you shook hands with darkness than to accept that you fought through it. It's easier to imagine something sinister behind your success than to admit they watched you struggle and did nothing. See, people are comfortable when you're predictable, when you're small, when you stay exactly where they expect you to be. But the moment you break that pattern, even just a crack, it unsettles them, not because of what you did, but because of what it says about them. One small win, that's all it takes. Funny, isn't it? You can spend years being overlooked, underestimated, pushed into corners no one bothers to look at. You can bleed in silence, fail in private, rebuild yourself piece by piece where no one's watching. And the world, it stays quiet, comfortable, unbothered by your existence. But the moment something shifts, just a little, everything changes. That one small win becomes louder than all your silent suffering combined. They didn't see the nights you questioned everything. They didn't hear the conversations you had with yourself when giving up felt easier than breathing. They weren't there when you chose discipline over distraction, when you dragged yourself forward without applause, without reassurance, without anyone telling you it would be worth it. But now they see you, not the journey, not the damage, just the result, and it confuses them, because in their version of reality, you were never supposed to move. You were never supposed to rise, even slightly. You had a role, a fixed place in their minds, and you stayed there for so long that they mistook it for who you are. So when you break that image, even a little, it doesn't inspire them. It unsettles them. They start digging for explanations, not because they care about your growth, but because they need to protect their understanding of the world. If you can change, if you can win, even once, then what does that say about them? About all the times they chose comfort instead of effort. That's a dangerous thought. So they bury it. They convince themselves your win wasn't real, that it was luck, coincidence, something external, anything but the truth. Because the truth forces them to confront something they've been avoiding. That you were working while they were watching. That you were evolving while they were standing still. And that realization, it stings. So they erase your struggle from the story. They reduce everything you've been through into a single moment, a single outcome, as if it just appeared out of nowhere. Like you woke up one day and everything magically aligned in your favor. No context, no history, no pain. Just the win. It's almost insulting, isn't it? How easily they ignore the weight behind that one step forward. How quickly they dismiss the years it took to get there. But that's how it works. People don't measure effort. They measure visibility. And your struggle was invisible. Your growth happened in the dark, in places where validation doesn't exist. So when the light finally hits you, even for a second, they assume it's the beginning of your story, not the continuation of a battle you've been fighting alone. That one small win becomes a spotlight, and suddenly everyone's an expert on how you got there. They analyze it, question it, dissect it like it doesn't belong to you, like it needs justification, like your progress is something that has to be explained instead of respected, because accepting it as real means accepting that you earned it. And accepting that means admitting they could have done the same, but they didn't. So instead of seeing your win for what it is, a glimpse of everything you've endured, they shrink it, distort it, turn it into something easier to digest, not because your win is small, but because your struggle was too big for them to understand. People don't really doubt your growth. They doubt what it forces them to confront. You step outside the version of yourself they got comfortable with, and suddenly it feels like you've broken an unspoken agreement. You weren't supposed to change like that. Not so soon. Not without permission. Not without fitting into the pace they chose for themselves. Because your growth doesn't exist in isolation. It reflects. It exposes. It quietly asks questions no one wants to answer. You start becoming disciplined, focused, sharper, and instead of curiosity, you're met with skepticism. Not because what you're doing is impossible, but because it disrupts what they've convinced themselves is enough. They built their comfort zone carefully, layer by layer, excuses, delays. I'll start tomorrow. It's not the right time. I'm just being realistic. It's a fragile structure, but it works as long as no one shakes it. Then you walk in with your change. Not loud, not dramatic, just different. And that difference becomes pressure. Now they have to look at you and wonder why you moved while they stayed still. Why you chose discipline when they chose ease. Why you kept going when they stopped. It's not a comparison you asked for, but it exists anyway. So instead of questioning themselves, they question you. Is this sustainable? Are you overdoing it? Why are you acting different? It sounds like concern, but it's not. It's discomfort disguised as curiosity. Because if your growth is real, then their inaction becomes visible. And that's not something people handle well. They start looking for cracks in your progress, waiting for you to slip, to fall back, to prove that change like yours doesn't last. Not out of hatred, but out of relief. Because if you fall, it validates their decision to stay the same. See? People don't resist your success. They resist the pressure it puts on their identity. You were part of their balance, their reference point. Someone they could look at and feel secure about where they stood. And now that balance is shifting. You're no longer predictable. You're no longer easy to define, and that makes people uneasy. So they try to bring you back to something familiar. They remind you of who you used to be, not because they care about your past, but because your past is easier for them to accept than your present. They'll say you've changed like it's a bad thing, like growth is betrayal, like becoming better is something you need to explain. But what they're really saying is that your evolution doesn't fit into their comfort zone anymore. And instead of expanding their mindset, they try to shrink your progress. It's subtle, quiet, sometimes even unintentional, but it's there. The doubt, the hesitation, the sideways comments that make you question yourself for a second, that make you wonder if maybe you are doing too much, moving too fast, stepping too far outside the lines. That's the moment where most people stop. Not because they can't continue, but because they don't want to feel misunderstood. But growth doesn't ask for approval. It doesn't wait for everyone else to feel comfortable before it moves forward. It happens whether people understand it or not. And the truth is, the more you grow, the more uncomfortable it will make those who chose not to. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because your progress removes the excuses they've been hiding behind. Success has a strange effect on people who never witnessed the process behind it. They see the outcome and nothing else. No context, no history, no understanding of what it took to get there. Just a moment frozen in time where everything seems to be working in your favor. And to them, that moment feels unnatural, out of place, almost suspicious, because pain leaves no visible record. There's no proof of the nights you spent doubting yourself, no evidence of the failures you buried quietly, no trace of the times you started over when no one was paying attention. All of that stays hidden, locked behind closed doors, erased from the version of you they interact with now. So when success finally shows up, it looks clean, too clean, like it came easy, and that's where the suspicion begins. They start trying to connect dots they were never there to see, trying to make sense of a story they only caught the ending of. And since they missed everything that mattered, they fill in the gaps with assumptions. Something's off. This doesn't add up. How did you get there so fast? But speed is an illusion when you ignore the timeline. What looks like a sudden rise is usually the result of a long, invisible grind. Years of quiet effort compressed into a single visible moment. But they don't see that. They only see the surface, and the surface doesn't tell the truth. So they question it. Not directly, not always out loud, but it lingers in the way they look at you, in the tone of their voice, in the half-jokes that carry just enough doubt to make you notice. Because to them, your success doesn't match the version of you they remember. And that version was easier to understand. Struggling, uncertain, still figuring things out. That made sense. That was familiar. It fit the narrative they had built around you. But this new version, this one that's winning, improving, moving forward, it doesn't fit. And when something doesn't fit, people don't always update their perspective. They question the reality instead. It's easier to believe something external caused your success than to accept that something internal changed within you. That you adapted, evolved, pushed past limits they assumed were permanent. Because if you can do that, then those limits weren't real to begin with. And that thought makes people uncomfortable. So they turn your success into a mystery instead of a result. They treat it like something that needs explaining, something that must have a hidden cause. Luck, connections, shortcuts, anything that makes it feel less earned and more accidental. Not because they want to discredit you, but because they can't reconcile your present with the version of you they held on to. And the truth is, people trust what they understand, They trust struggle when it's visible, when it's ongoing, when it fits their expectations. But when struggle disappears and success takes its place, without them witnessing the transition, it feels disconnected, almost unreal. Like watching the final scene of a story without seeing everything that came before it. And instead of admitting they missed the journey, they question the ending. They pick it apart, analyze it, look for inconsistencies that justify their confusion, because accepting it as real would require them to admit they underestimated you, that they didn't see your potential when it was right in front of them, that they misjudged you. And people don't like admitting that, so they doubt the success instead. They look at what you've built and search for flaws, not because the flaws are obvious, but because doubt feels safer than acknowledgement, because acknowledging your success means accepting that everything you went through had a purpose, that all the quiet pain, the unseen effort, the silent persistence, actually led somewhere real. And for someone who never saw that pain, that reality feels harder to believe than the idea that something about your success just doesn't make sense. People don't just misunderstand your rise, they rewrite it. Not openly, not in a way that sounds cruel at first. It starts subtle. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there, a quiet shift in how they talk about you when you're not around. Little pieces of a story being rearranged until it fits something they're more comfortable believing. Because the truth is inconvenient. The truth says you worked while they watched. The truth says you kept going when they stopped. The truth says you made choices they avoided, faced things they ignored, pushed through moments they would have walked away from. And that kind of truth doesn't sit well with people who chose not to act. So they edit it. They take your effort out of the equation. They remove the struggle, the persistence, the discipline, all the parts that make your progress real, and replace them with something easier to accept. Luck, timing, connections, anything that makes your rise feel accidental instead of intentional. Because if your success is intentional, then their lack of progress isn't just circumstance, it's a decision. And that realization comes with weight most people aren't willing to carry. So they lighten it. They tell themselves a different story, one where your results don't reflect their inaction, one where your growth isn't a mirror showing them what they could have done differently. In their version, things just happened for you. You got a break. You were in the right place at the right time. You had something they didn't. It sounds harmless, almost logical on the surface, but underneath it, there's a quiet refusal to acknowledge the one thing that matters most, that you showed up consistently when it wasn't rewarding, when it wasn't visible, when it didn't make sense to anyone but you. That kind of effort is uncomfortable to recognize because it removes the illusion that success is random. And once that illusion is gone, there's nothing left to hide behind. No excuses, no justifications. No, maybe one day. Just the reality that progress comes from action, and action requires responsibility. So instead of accepting that they reshape your story into something that protects them from that responsibility, they turn your discipline into coincidence, your persistence into luck, your growth into something external, something out of reach, something that doesn't apply to them. Because if it doesn't apply to them, they don't have to change. They don't have to question their habits, their mindset, their choices. They can stay exactly where they are without feeling like they're falling behind. And that's the goal. Not to understand you, not to celebrate you, but to maintain their own sense of comfort. It's not always malicious. Most of the time, it's automatic, a defense mechanism, a way for people to protect their identity from being challenged by your progress. But the effect is the same. Your story gets distorted. The years of effort get compressed into a moment of good fortune. The setbacks disappear. The resilience fades into the background. And what's left is a version of your success that feels detached from who you really are. Something they can dismiss if they need to. Something they can point to and say, "That's not realistic," without ever having to look at what made it real in the first place. And the more you grow, the more this happens. Because the bigger your progress becomes, the harder it is for them to ignore. The harder it is to explain away without fully committing to a version of reality where your effort doesn't count. So they double down. They build stronger narratives, more convincing explanations, more detailed versions of a story that keeps them safe from the truth. A truth that doesn't accuse them, doesn't attack them, doesn't even involve them directly, but quietly proves that everything they've been waiting for was always within reach, and they chose not to reach for it. You outgrow the version of yourself they memorized, and suddenly, you don't feel familiar anymore. That's where the tension begins. Because people don't just see you for who you are. They hold on to who you were. They build a fixed image over time, piece by piece, based on your past behavior, your struggles, your limitations, your patterns. And once that image settles in their mind, it becomes your identity in their world. Predictable, understandable, safe. You were the one who hesitated, the one who doubted, the one who stayed within certain boundaries, who moved at a certain pace, who fit into a certain role. It made sense to them. It aligned with what they believed about you. Then you change. Not all at once, not in a way that announces itself loudly. It starts internally. A shift in mindset, a decision to stop repeating the same cycles, a refusal to stay where you've been. You begin to act differently, think differently, respond differently. And that's when things stop matching. The person they remember and the person you're becoming don't align anymore. And instead of updating their perception, they hesitate. Because updating that perception requires letting go of certainty. It means admitting they didn't fully understand you, that they placed limits on you that weren't real, that they defined you too early, too narrowly, too comfortably. That's not easy to accept. So instead, they question the change. Why are you acting like this? You've changed. This isn't like you. It sounds like observation, but underneath it, there's resistance. Because to them, your growth feels like inconsistency. Not evolution, inconsistency. Like you've stepped outside the role you were assigned without explanation. Like you've broken character in a story they thought they understood. And that creates a kind of discomfort they can't quite explain. You're no longer easy to categorize, and people rely on categories more than they realize. It helps them navigate relationships, expectations, interactions. It gives them a sense of control. knowing who someone is, how they'll react, what they're capable of. But when you outgrow those categories, you introduce uncertainty, and uncertainty makes people uneasy. So they try to pull you back into something familiar. They remind you of your past, not to celebrate how far you've come, but to anchor you to who you used to be. They bring up old habits, old mistakes, old versions of you that no longer exist, hoping to reinforce the identity they're comfortable with. Because that version of you doesn't challenge anything. That version fits neatly into their expectations. But this new version, this one, that's evolving, improving, refusing to stay the same, this one disrupts that balance. It forces them to reconsider everything they assumed about you. And more than that, it forces them to consider the possibility that people aren't fixed. That change is real. That growth is possible. And if that's true for you, then it's true for them too. Which means staying the same isn't just a circumstance. It's a choice. That realization sits heavy. So instead of embracing your growth, they question your identity. They act like you're becoming someone else. Like you're losing authenticity. Like you're drifting away from something important. But what they're really reacting to is the loss of the version of you that made sense to them. The version they could predict. The version that didn't make them uncomfortable. Because growth doesn't just change you. It changes how people relate to you. And not everyone is ready for that shift. Some will adapt. Some will understand. But others will hold onto the past so tightly that they start seeing your progress as a departure instead of an upgrade. Like you've left something behind that you were supposed to carry forever. But you didn't outgrow them. You outgrew the limits they placed on you. Your rise doesn't just elevate you. It quietly destroys something people have been relying on. Limits, not the real kind, the physical ones, the unavoidable ones, but the invisible lines people draw in their minds to make sense of where they stand. The boundaries they accept without question. The ceilings they convince themselves are fixed, permanent, unbreakable. You were part of that system. Whether you realized it or not, your position, your struggles, your pace. It all contributed to a shared understanding of what was possible and what wasn't. You fit within those limits, just like everyone else. You reinforced them simply by existing inside them, and then you stepped out. Not dramatically, not in a way that made headlines, just enough to disrupt the pattern. And that's all it takes. Because the moment you cross a line that others believed couldn't be crossed, that line doesn't just disappear for you. It disappears for everyone watching. That's what makes people uncomfortable. It's not just that you succeeded. It's that your success invalidates the boundaries they've been hiding behind. The ones they use to explain their inaction, to justify their hesitation, to make peace with staying exactly where they are. I can't do that. That's not for people like me. That's unrealistic. Those statements only work as long as no one proves otherwise. And now you have. Even if it's just one step, one achievement, one small break from the pattern. It's enough to crack the illusion. Because limits don't survive evidence. Once someone sees that something is possible, truly possible, it changes the equation. It removes the certainty of impossibility and replaces it with a question. If they did it, Why can't I? That question is dangerous, not because it demands an answer, but because it demands responsibility. It shifts the focus inward. It forces people to look at their own choices, their own effort, their own willingness to act. And most people don't want that. They don't want to examine the gap between where they are and where they could be, especially if that gap is filled with decisions they chose not to make. It's easier to believe in limits than to confront the absence of action. So when you rise, you don't just challenge their perception of you. You challenge their entire belief system. And belief systems don't collapse quietly. They resist. They push back in subtle ways: doubt, criticism, dismissal. Not always directed at you personally, but at what you represent. Because what you represent is a break in the narrative they've been telling themselves for years. A narrative where things stay the same, where effort doesn't always pay off, where change is rare, difficult, almost impossible. You disrupt that, and disruption creates tension. They start looking for ways to preserve their limits, to rebuild the boundaries you've broken. They'll say your situation is different, that you had advantages, that your path isn't replicable. Anything to restore the idea that what you did doesn't apply to them, because if it does, then those limits were never real. And if those limits were never real, then every moment spent obeying them becomes something harder to accept, something heavier, something they can't ignore anymore. So they protect the illusion, not because they're weak, but because the truth requires change, and change demands effort, and effort means stepping into uncertainty, risking failure, letting go of comfort, all the things they've been avoiding by believing in limits in the first place. But your rise stands there, undeniable, a quiet contradiction to everything they've convinced themselves of. Proof that the walls they've been leaning on were never walls at all,